Thank you so much, and welcome to Whatcom Reads. We're delighted to share this evening with all of you. So I'm very excited for you guys to meet Sunil Yapa. He's a delightful man with an amazing story to share, and I know that's what we're all here to talk about. His amazing book, Your Heart is a Muscle the Size of a Fist. Sunil's novel is about the 1999 WTO protests in Seattle, seen through the eyes of police, protesters, delegates, and others. Whatcom Reads is a partnership of all the public and academic libraries in Bellingham and Whatcom County, along with Village Books. Two other very important organizations provide funding for this event, and those organizations are the Friends of the Bellingham Public Library and the Whatcom County Library Foundation. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. Please help me welcome to the stage Sunil Yapa. Welcome.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. What an honor it is to be here. Is that mic gonna? Can you hear me? I just want to say, first of all, thanks for a beautiful introduction. Do you want to do a selfie? Yeah, let's do it. Well, let me say something. One thing, which is why we're going to do the selfie. When I was writing this book, I started almost 10 years ago, and I really never expected to have the kind of reaction that I've had, and so it's wonderful. I started touring for the book in 2015, and was went all over the world and all over the country, and had a really busy 2 years up until the point where last fall I had to just sort of stop everything, go to my dad's house in the country in Pennsylvania, let my beard grow and play guitar and kind of unwind from it all. And this is one of the sort of big events, the first big events I've done since I did that, and it's been wonderful because I can appreciate it. I'm not exhausted, this is the fourth event we've done now, and they've all had a lot of people, a lot of great questions, and I can really feel it, and I feel very, very grateful to all of you for coming out and for the community for having me, and it's really exciting. We're so excited that I want to do a selfie with all of you guys.
Do
one more?
Oh, yeah, okay, one more.
Do one with my camera, too. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I thought I would read from the book a little bit, but what I've really been enjoying and been really pleasantly surprised by is that is the amount of questions and how pointed the questions have been. So I really would enjoy, rather than just talking at you, having a conversation and answering some of your questions. And I've led a pretty interesting life, I suppose, while I was working on this book. Just a few hints in case you get stuck for questions. But I lived in 17 different places while I was writing the book. It took me 6 years to write the book because I had to write it twice, and we can talk about that. It won't be too traumatic. And I had to come up with a lot of different ways to write it. And of course, there's a very strong connection to this specific place, being in the Northwest. So I would love to talk about all that and any craft things you want to talk about, and we'll do that. But I want you to get your money's worth, so I'm going to read. We'll read a little bit too. So the book, if you guys don't know, is set during one day of the 1999 Seattle WTO protests. And I follow 7 different characters on the day. We have Victor, who is a 19-year-old biracial kid, kind of lost. He's living under the Alaska Way Viaduct, which is not a real safe place to be living, but he has run away from home. He's back in Seattle, and he is trying to sell pot to the protesters. And so if there's any aspiring writers out in the audience, this is just like a free little writing tip I'll give you. you find a good character, give them a terrible idea, like selling pot at a protest, and then let them go and see all the mistakes they're going to make. But the point is, he's not really political, and he's really our window into the protest, I think. And also, while it's a story about a protest and all these different people at a protest, it really is in some ways a father and son story, and that was something that I sort of discovered while I was writing it, that was really important to me, about Victor, who's 19, who's trying to sell pot at the protest, not political, and his father, who's the chief of police, who is really not prepared for these protests. He hasn't scheduled enough officers, and way more people have showed up, which is true to facts, true to what really happened, and has to make some very difficult decisions about what he's going to do to clear the streets. Specifically whether he's going to tear gas 50,000 nonviolent protesters or not. So there's the two of them. A big part of the book is whether they're going to be able to reconcile. And I didn't know. I had a lot of plans for the book, and about 2/3 of the way through, I had to scrap them because I was just sort of, at that point, the character so well, you're just going wherever the book takes you. So those are the two, I think, main characters. There's also two cops who are in the street, trying to make sense of what's happening, trying to do their job in different ways and to varying degrees of success. There are two pretty hardcore protesters, and there is a delegate who's here in Seattle for the meetings. So he's from Sri Lanka, where my father is from. That's a little bit fictional. Sri Lanka had already been a member of the WTO, I think since its founding, but I knew the history of Sri Lanka, so I used that. And he's here he's in Seattle, for the meetings, and he really believes that free trade, so-called free trade and development will really benefit his country. And I really enjoyed writing those sections because it's a third perspective on these protests, and one that we don't often consider in that narrative. So that's the back jacket stuff, the long version. I thought I would read to you from the beginning of the book, and it starts with Victor. And I don't think you need to know anything. We'll just jump right in. The match struck and sputtered. Victor tried again. He put match head to phosphate strip with the gentle pressure of one long finger, and the thing sparked and caught, and for the briefest of moments he held a yellow flame. Victor curled into himself like a question mark, a joint hanging from his mouth. Victor, with his hair natural in two thick braids, a red bandana folded and knotted to hold them back. Victor, with his dark eyes and his thin shoulders and his cafecito con leche skin, wearing a pair of classic Air Jordans, the leather so white it glowed. Imagine him how you will, because he hardly knew how to see himself. He was 19 years old and should have felt as sweet as a bluebird in the dew. But in the awful damp of the early morning, after another night of sleeping on cold concrete or not sleeping, he moved like an old man, grumbling like the world was out to get him. Had in fact perhaps already gotten him. Struck him down without mercy or care or intent, as if it hadn't even seen him standing there, he'd just been in the way. He knelt and made a cup of his two brown hands. Look at him there, bowing his head to this fragile light, joint pinched between his lips. Wearing a puffy down jacket, olive green and so ragged he might have found it abandoned on the beach. Listen to the quiet rhythm of his breath. This is his morning ritual, the closest this boy comes to prayer. Skinny Victor, who believed in his heart of hearts that most everything was bullshit. For 3 years he had tramped the world, and still he had no idea just how it worked, how people managed daily life on this blue-green planet of slums and smog, the easy knife, the lazy blade. The traffic on the freeway thundered over his head. The sound of the big trucks hitting the joints of the highway was a muted clacking like a pair of spoons. Beyond the cave of the underpass, beyond the water and the warehouses, out in the city where the streets climbed from the docks to the downtown core, the sound of the chanting crowd was a distant buzzing. 50,000 desperate flies knocking against 50,000 closed windows. Victor had heard talk of it for weeks. At the shelter, bumming smokes from the tourist on the pier. At the coffee shop, nursing a tea and swiping scraps from the empty plates. And now, here they were, thousands in the streets. And the way their voices rose and fell, sliding down the hill, ringing off the renovated lofts, the brick apartments, the cars parked nose to tail along the oil-black street. It was like an alarm bell sounding in his chest. It was the million-voiced ocean roar of Calcutta or Caracas, booming from their angry mouths, an alarm ringing in his chest saying, "Go, go, go." In the morning when he woke up, and at night before turning in, and during the odd, wind-blown moments of the day when the boredom or regret or homesickness were so heavy he felt them like a knot in the pit of his stomach, he swept and tidied. He put things in their place. Joint in his pocket, braids behind his ears, memory and longing of black gunpowder, he tamped down the wide-bored barrel of his neck. Because that was what you did to keep the loneliness at bay. To keep at arm's length the sense that you may have made a vital mistake somewhere. Or maybe it was your parents. Or maybe it was just the world in general that had everything up. Thoughts like these could not enter the swept half-moon he carved thrice daily in front of his tent. Thoughts like these had a certain regard for cleanliness, for industrious energy and purpose. Doing something, he had discovered, anything, however small, that contributed to your meaningfulness of self and surroundings, well, that was the trick. That was the trick to not feel it. Victor zipped his tent tight, and he dropped a little lock on the zip, and then he was hoofing it up the hill in his white Jordans, his olive green jacket with the rough-lined hood keeping him warm. Sludgy Seattle light painted the buildings around him gray gold, reflecting bright off the broken windows of the warehouses to the east, the gray project towers to the north, with laundry flapping on the balconies like flags of a tenement nation. By the time he turned the corner and hit the crowd, he was sweating. And the sheer human multitude, the force of all this compressed humanity, nearly knocked him over. There were people hollering from every corner, marching people of all shapes and sizes, all body types and hairdos, an assortment of clothing choices and fashion accessories to express their personalities. And he did a little clap with the chant, nodding his head to catch the rhythm of the thing, and he watched them spinning delirious in the street. Hippies in their Gore-Tex, punks in their sweaty denim. And the entire motley crowd chanting and now singing, old and young, their voices raised to the cloudy sky as if song were the very root of being. He didn't know whether to stand or sit, to go streaking through the city with his hands on his head, or to collapse in the street in open-mouthed wonder. Because here they came, stomping into the dawn from their suburban warrens, from their gorgeous mansions that glittered fat on the sound. Civil rights lawyers wearing combat boots. Radical teachers in sheepskin-lined jackets. He saw them come rising into the morning air, a chant on their lips. What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now. But what did that mean, justice? He looked at a blonde girl in overalls, an African-type shawl looped atop her head. He looked at her angry blue eyes, her perfect white teeth, her gym-sculpted arm naked to the cold, and he didn't know what justice meant to her, to him, to anybody in this country. He saw them come rising from north-faced tents gone swampy with sex, from the paint-splattered warehouse where they gathered to gossip and train, from the cellar of the church where they had sat in fold-out chairs discussing what they knew of what they called the third world. And there was a look on their faces, all their sweet, round, high-fructose faces, that was hoping everything was more or less okay with the world, even though they knew it wasn't. And Victor, looking at that look, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Because here came the defenders of democracy, riding the ferry in from the islands, climbing down from the haze of an interstate bus, crossing the bridge in their Subarus, their aging Toyotas, their cheap American rolling junk, and Victor bestowed with the unenviable gift of geography and sight. Looked at their t-shirts and their flannels and their fleeces, their backpacks and jeans, and he thought of the factories along the border in Mexico, the lines of women waiting for work to begin, the razor wire fences behind which the things of the world were made, the smoke curling into the sky like a pencil drawing of a drowned woman's hair. And he thought, how do you protest this? 3 topless girls went by crying, "Death to the police state," their breasts bouncing in the cold air, duct tape across their nipples. I was at a reading before I took my break, and someone jumped up and said, "That was me!" So I was sort of expecting that being, no one? Okay. It's real, though. It's real. It's not just my fantasy. Victor almost expected to see families lining the sidewalks, mothers and fathers set up in beach chairs and blankets, children hoisted onto shoulders crying, "Daddy, Daddy, here come the beasts." It was a painted carnival for the end of days, and on an impulse, just the weird out-of-body feeling of it, Victor turned to the guy next to him, a hefty guy in a blue jacket, and said, "Hey, man, you need any weed?" "Do I need any what?" he said. On closer inspection, the guy seemed to be a union man, the bulk and size of him, the rusty air of his moonscape face. One of the guys who worked down at the docks or something, his face folded like an old jacket. "Any weed, man? You need any weed?" The guy looked to see was Victor kidding. He was walking and holding hands with his union buddies, or whatever, a great long line of them, bowling league buddies holding hands, which Victor thought was kind of weird. "Trust me," Victor said more loudly, "it's great." The guy looked at him like he might be contagious. "Kid," the big man said, "What?" "Get the out of here." Victor slid his bandana from his forehead, shook his damp braids, and felt the stuffy weight of their bodies shuffling by. Their signs, their hope, their smell of incense and baked-in sweat. And he was remembering and living and thinking and dying more or less all at the same time. It was 1999 in America. He had traveled the world for 3 years looking for what he didn't know. And now, here he found himself, absolutely allergic to belief, 19 years old, and totally alone. So that's Victor. And I explained it in an earlier session, and it's really a bad habit that I'm about to do it again. But a little bit of a craft thing. This style of writing is called, among writers, close third. So it's a third person. As an author, I'm writing about characters using he and she. But the idea is to let my language be influenced by the character's language so that they mix a little bit, and we almost get the sense that we might be in first person, that the language itself is warped, if you will, by the gravity of their personality. And I say that only because I sometimes get embarrassed reading this, because it's not exactly my language. It's not exactly me speaking. It's me. It's sort of like method acting, I guess. Me channeling Victor, if you will. But it's not all me. There's Victor, who's not very political. There are two. There are two activists who are incredibly political, and I think I'll read you one. Maybe I'll read you both of them. One of them is named King, and when people ask me who's me in the book, I suppose, superficially, or like census statistics, it's Victor. He looks the most like me. At that age, I had long hair. When I was 19, I had long hair. I have, cafecito con leche is, coffee with milk. So I guess I have coffee with milk skin. And I have, or had, some of the bad habits that Victor has as well. But I'd like to believe I was a little more mature than he is, or a little bit, maybe not, probably not. Probably not. But, so he's the most like me, I guess, superficially. But in fact, King, this woman, has a lot of me in her, I think. Or at least, thinking about this subject, about protest, but more importantly, the larger subject, which is, I think, what is the world we live in, and why does it look the way that it does, and how do we feel about other people in this world, and how do we feel about the world that we're born into that we don't really have a role in making, but, where our incredible material wealth, the fact that I can buy 10 t-shirts for $6 is really based on the fact that someone who made those t-shirts only got paid, 50 cents. And without preaching, I just think that we live in a very interesting world. We live in a globalized world, and it's something that really started probably in the early 80s. I studied geography, so I could give you a lecture about globalization, and from the steamship to the container ship, and from the telegraph to I guess the mobile phone, and there you have it, globalization. But apart from that, I just think we are forced to deal with a lot of disparate information from different parts of the world, and somehow make sense of it all in our head. And about pieces of information that don't really fit well together, So King is struggling to do that, and I will admit there are times when, personally, I feel pretty angry about, or I feel a certain rage that I don't know where it comes from. And so Victor looks like me, but a lot of the characters are my own experience of the world. And King is one of those aspects. But again, exaggerated a little bit for dramatic effect. Why don't I let her just talk? I'll shut up. Are there kids in the audience? Is it okay if I use a few bad words? Okay, so I apologize. Her name was Kingfisher, but her friends just called her King. I feel like the anticipation of the bad words. There's not for a couple pages. I'll raise my hand when they. Her name was Kingfisher, and her favorite word was no. I'm sorry. Okay. Her name was Kingfisher, but her friends just called her King. She liked King, the small bite of irony, this 27-year-old white woman with dreads to the small of her back. She was tall, olive-skinned, vaguely Mediterranean, if Mediterranean meant you were trash from coal mining country who could catch a tan easy. Her mother, when drinking, claimed some Cherokee blood way back in their family tree, and that was just fine with King. She was muscled, thin, and tough. This woman with ambiguously light brown skin, with green eyes as bright as any sea, who at one time ran a sort of illegal animal shelter behind her off-the-grid house on an unnamed island beyond the city, who journeyed here with 4 friends in an Econoline van, the 4 of them eating sandwiches of sprouts and beans. This pretty girl in laced black boots who wore black jeans and a loose white shirt, the sleeves rolled to the shoulder like some kind of back alley tough. Well, she had the kindest of smiles. A smile which creased her mouth and lit those green eyes, and which you could see were she not currently wearing a full-face black gas mask. There was a time, perhaps, when it could have been said King was in love with violent revolution. At 18, she carried Che Guevara in a keychain. She read live from death row and quoted Mumia Abu-Jamal to her growing circle of activist friends. It started as a simple infatuation. A New York City girl, a Brooklyn transplant, rising from the cinders of the dead hamlet where she had been born. She read FBI surveillance reports on John Lennon. She studied the details of CIA assassinations in Colombia, in Congo, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Iran, in Angola, in Greece. At age 19, she went to her first protest. The School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, where the American military taught Central and South American leaders how to torture their own people. One night, camped in a muddy field, she slept with a tow-headed, gangly boy with a southern drawl who was not her first, technically, but the sex wasn't bad and the conversation was better, and she discovered to her surprise it was sort of thrilling to fuck someone who believed what you believe. This is the bad word signal. At the age of 22, she learned how to hop freights and headed west. Her confidence grew. She made friends, and in the high-altitude forests of Colorado, they studied revolution. They gave her, she read the books they gave her, Manufacturing Consent, If They Come in the Morning, copies of the journal Earth First. Her friends and her books gave voice to what had been inarticulate. They gave shape and mission to what had been a formless longing. She practiced climbing and spiking. On the western slopes of the Continental Divide, she tore distributor caps from 12-ton cats. She sugared tanks and hammered sharpened steel rebar into logging roads. She went camping and torched a ski resort. The cascading whump of ignition, of pleasure she felt from the flat muscles of her belly all the way to the crown of her head. Yes, there had been a time when it could be said that King felt the burning glow of violence, but no longer. Now she believed in the transformative power of militant nonviolence. Now she suffered to see so many thrown into the fire, which is why King could not believe that here she was talking with a police officer. King was watching a mounted cop in the front line halfway down the block where things were a little loose. There was something about him which had caught her attention. He was a medium-sized white man, maybe 30, unremarkable, save for the birthmark, or was it a burn, ascending pink and smooth from the left side of his mouth, over his cheek, and into the whiteness of his hair beneath the riot helmet. God damn. Looked like a slab of raw steak. Visible from 50 feet away, and King felt momentarily heartsick. She had a flash of recognition, a moment's transportation to her childhood in western Pennsylvania when she had been what? 13, 14, and her stepfather, who'd worked for a while as a short-order cook because he didn't have the temperament for coal, couldn't stand the cage or the drop or the dust, least of all the darkness. And what else was there to do for money after the mills closed and your education consisted mostly of knowing the difference between pounders and ponies? Those are types of beer bottles in Pennsylvania. Well, this guy, her mom's new husband, and clearly I have that education anyway. Well, this guy, her mom's new husband or boyfriend or whatever, he had some sort of accident at the restaurant. Something had happened when he was changing the oil in the deep fryer, and he deep fried his face. When the gauze came off, however many months later, the left side of his head looked like it had been pressed to a sheet of hot steel. His left ear reduced to a lump of melted wax. A 13-year-old girl, what did she think about that? She didn't think anything about that. She knew he deserved it. Well, this cop's face looked nothing as bad as that, but he was messing with a kid, and for King, really, the feeling was the same. She pulled the gas mask from around her neck and slung it on her hand to Edie. Edie caught it by the strap and winked. "Go get him, girl," she said. King crossed into the 30-foot strip of pavement that separated the front line of cops from the heaving, surging crowd behind her. Into the no man's land and down the street, heading for the cop. She looked for the officer who seemed to be in charge, a tanned older man in glasses who had been making unintelligible pronouncements on a megaphone. "I don't want to hurt you this, I don't want to hurt you that." And King saw the truck parked down the street behind some buses, but she didn't see the chief anywhere. The cops all watched her coming. All, that is, except the mounted asshole on the horse. He didn't even notice her until she was beside his horse and the boy. Her body so close to the horse she could feel the heat coming off his heaving sides, the horse. And ridiculous, yes, she knew, she longed to reach out and stroke the soft hair, to comfort the animal with her touch. "Hi," she said loudly, neck craned backward to see the man's mangled face. Up close, it was even worse, the skin angry and red, glistening in the drizzle as if it were made of plastic. Suddenly, his riot baton was out of its holster and pointed at her chest. "Miss," he said, "please return to your people." "Hey, that's a little aggressive," King said, still smiling, trying to keep her voice bright. "Swiping at me like that, I just want to talk." But what she really wanted to do was touch that horse. Miss, return to your people. Why don't you leave the kid alone, King said. This is a peaceful protest. Miss, I'm not warning you again. Step back. She felt the other cops watching with interest, and she took one more step forward, reaching for the horse's flank with one hand and with the other taking gentle hold of the backpack. The horse shied away from her hand, lifting its feet high and moving a foot or two away. The cop let go of the backpack, and suddenly she was staggering with the weight of it, feeling the first flush of triumph running hot in her veins. Hey, his voice suddenly beyond angry. I said, that's enough. Now step back. King knew she was antagonizing him. She should never have touched the horse, but she was beginning to feel a little amped. That familiar current of voltage as she got her first real taste of action. Once that juice got going in your veins, it was tough to stop. She should know. She was a student of conflict. She had been trained in the tactics, techniques, and philosophy of nonviolence. When she had lived in New York City, she used to go into the federal prisons, the maximum security blocks where the prisoners were on lockdown 22 hours out of 24. The murderers and rapists, the friendly, demented men who had taken a hammer to their neighbor's skull in an argument over a dented car door. She went into the federal prisons, this green-eyed woman with dreads to the small of her back, and they respected her. They talked to her. No, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am, I should not have hit him with the hammer, ma'am. Her heart tripped over itself every time she entered the prison. No matter how many times she went, she never got used to that electric buzz and rattle as the double sliding electronic doors rolled shut behind her. But it wasn't that she was frightened of the men. No, it was that she was frightened for them. Because anger expressed in prison, well, who would be the one to suffer? This was why a prison employed guards, was it not? In the corralling of all the unaccountable emotions. But that was the thing with anger. That was the tricky thing about pain. Sometimes it was hiding around a corner, just waiting to slice you from stomach to throat. She studied the mounted cop, something loose and frantic in his eyes, and she imagined the nightmare scenarios pounding in his brain. Molotov cocktails, blown out storefronts, the city descending into explosion and flame. Miss, he said, step away from the horse. And she knew instinctively that she needed to de-escalate the situation. She needed to find some way to relate, some way to empathize. But the problem she was discovering was that she didn't want to de-escalate the situation. She didn't want to empathize. Miss, he said again, and now there was no mistaking the tremor of impending violence in his voice. Step back. I don't want to hurt you. King leaned forward. She laid her hand along the horse's neck, and then pitching her voice low and kind of sexy, said with a smile, you want to hurt me, darling? I'd sure like to see you try. So that's old King. And so the backpack in question is a backpack full of weed that Victor was trying to sell, who someone rightly pointed out this afternoon. He said, what happens to the backpack? He didn't want to know what happened to Victor or any other characters. What happens to the backpack? Because it just disappears. But Victor is kind of adopted by King, and how scary is that? And gets involved in the protest, and that's sort of his window into the protest. And I could read you a section of that, but I think I'm going to just read one more short section, and then we'll open it up for questions, because I'd really like to hear from you guys. So there are quite a few other characters. We have the delegate. We have the two cops in the street who I find really interesting, and who I try to write with as much compassion as possible. And we can talk about that. That was a very interesting challenge. But I'm going to finish with another protester. And this is John Henry. This is King's running mate. And I like reading John Henry because, as I said earlier, the characters themselves, their language bends my language. And so John Henry is a former preacher. And so his language is a little elevated. It's a little bit lyrical. And so it's a lot of fun to read, especially on stage. So this will be the last section I'll read, and then we'll do questions. And thank you guys so much. John Henry stood in the crowd, inhaling them through every pore, perfectly at rest, perfectly at peace. My people. They smelled of onion and cigarette and sex, the human animal musk of 60 beautiful human bodies beneath their beautiful blue tarps, and he raised his arms to the sky and breathed them deep. Around him they marched and they danced, they chanted and they sang. He felt their voices buzzing in his chest, people linking arms with strangers they had never met, hand in hand with people whose homes they had never seen, and he closed his eyes and felt the power of what they were doing coiling around him. Some force inexorably gathering here at the edge of the millennium, 1 month from the end of the American century. Look at him there, this 44-year-old man in a hand-woven cowboy hat and chunky black Medicare glasses, his red beard long and wiry like some mountain monk. This was a man with the days stitched into his skin. This was a man you could imagine in a dream of the Himalaya, high above the clouds where the granite falls away like glass, and then you turn a corner and there he is, spinning a prayer wheel. Not from the Himalaya, but from Detroit, Michigan. Holy man of the Rust Belt, sacrament of iron and steel. Blessed be these assembly lines. Blessed be these tired hands. Look at his pierced ears and his crooked teeth. Look at his eyes shining behind those busted up glasses, the frames more duct tape than plastic, and know that if there's one place in the great, glorious, dying world he wanted to be, this was it. My people. John Henry had at one time been a churchman, storefront preacher, and inevitably it now seemed he had lost the church, but not the need. And here he was in the middle of it all, heart a broken clock spring in his chest, leading a chant. Ain't no power like the power of the people, and the power of the people don't stop. Say what? Their voices together were a roaring wave careening down the alleys, cascading off the cordon of metrobuses around the convention center, up through the air vents of the Sheraton, voices reaching for the delegates hiding in their rooms on the upper floors. John Henry could see some of them gathered in the lobby of the Sheraton, 2 floors above the street, shadowed forms pressed to the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands on either side of their faces like kids at the aquarium watching the sharks make their dumb circles in the tank. Ain't no power like the power of the people, and the power of the people don't stop. Say what? Cried John Henry. The American dream was dead. All those promises now just cold ashes between his people's chanting teeth, sitting heavy on their tongues. Instead, they said sustainable agriculture. They said global solidarity. They said how beautiful is a seed, a tender green stalk of life. They wore hooded sweatshirts peopled with homemade patches. They wore bandanas slashed outlaw style across the mouth, a triangle from nose to chin knotted at the neck. They ate bread and cabbage, looted from dumpsters because that was a form of political protest. And he loved each one of them enough to die for them if it came to that, which he hoped it would not. He stroked his beard and heard them say, people are more important than prophets. People, they said, are more important than prophets. People are more important than prophets. And their words had the quality of midnight prayer, as if the right words might call forth a future where they need march no more. They said, we're going to shut those corporate motherfuckers down. John Henry heard their voices and knew this was no ordinary protest, this congregation in the streets. No, this was the new American religion, this desire which leapt continents, the longing of the heart to embrace a stranger and be unashamed. 6 a.m. and he watched them swarming the streets of his city in a gauzy mausoleum light, a people's army climbing from basement mattresses and garage apartments, the skyline of the city black-crowned and spooky at their back. Look with him at his people. This man who once preached from a pulpit, John Henry, who was wound up and weary with too much love, too much joy, too much rage. Look with him at how they exit the church in an orderly fashion and tip their chins to the sky. Look at how they come from the darkness of their homes, back stiff, stretching and tying the bandanas tight, checking one another's faces for an idea of what violence this day might bring. Look with him at these wet American faces, ordinary and beautiful, and tell me you don't feel more than a little bit afraid. They wanted to tear down the borders, to make a leap into a kind of love that would be like living inside a new human skin, wanted to dream themselves into a life they didn't yet know. He heard them in the streets saying, another world is possible. And beneath his ribs, broken and healed, and twice broken and healed, and thrice broken and healed, he shuddered and thought, God help us. We are mad with hope. Here we come. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks, guys. Thank you. So I'd love to open it up for questions and have a chat. We have plenty of time. There are 2 microphones at the front of each aisle. And if you could come up so that we could all hear you, that would be wonderful. And feel free to ask anything.
I'm wondering if you can tell us, before you started writing the book, what was your emotional and personal connection to this day, the protest?
Sure.
And then I actually have a 2-part question.
You might have to remind me of the second part
okay.
afterwards. But go ahead.
And then is there another day in history that you're thinking would make a cool book?
Yeah, that's okay. First part first. So I wasn't at these protests. I mean, that's the first thing to say. Although I think, in spirit in some ways. I really grew up in this milieu. My dad is a professor of economic geography, and although he doesn't like it when I say this, he's a Marxist geographer. He hates it when I say that. He says post-Marxist, postmodern, blah, blah, blah. You're a Marxist. Own it. So when I was a kid, I really grew up. I don't think Marxist in the sense that he's critical of the U.S. He's just aware of the economy, right? Aware of the economic base of the U.S. And also we had the socialist version of Monopoly in our attic, so. Which is where I had a little Lego room up there. I had inherited all these cool Legos from my brother, and it was like my little office. I'd go up there and turn on the heat and put in my Phil Collins tape and get to building some Legos, A lot like, to be honest, a lot like being a writer, Now I go into my room and put on my Bob Dylan MP3 and, play with words. But back then I was playing with Legos and all of his books, I'm 6 years old, and all of his books that room was also his library, kind of his forgotten library, the books that he didn't use, the books from his radical years in the 60s and the 70s. And I would go through them when I was a kid. I mean, I didn't understand capital, but it was there. And there were a lot of other books. I think there was actually a copy of the Kama Sutra there, which I also didn't understand, but read. And then I also, because my dad was a professor, he had a sabbatical year. And we spent a year when I was very young, I was 6, I think, in 1984 or 5, something like that. We went to Holland for a year, and then we spent another year in Thailand. And that kind of thing when you're that young, I think, really gets into your bones, So I was very aware that people live different lives in different countries, and that there was something called the world outside of my hometown in Pennsylvania. Then as I was a college student, I was studying economic geography, and I was in college when the protests were happening. And to be 100% candid with you, I wanted to come. I thought I should come. I had friends that were coming, and I was too scared to come. I'll be deadly honest with you. I'd already been arrested for my bad habits that I shared with Victor. I'd gotten arrested for possession of dope as a kid. Stupid, but I'd spent a night in jail. And as a person of color, spending a night in jail in an unfriendly kind of town, it wasn't an experience I wanted to repeat. Now, having done research for the book and learning all that the preparation that went into people who did go to jail, I think it would have been a really empowering experience, and I wish I had come. In fact, and we'll talk a little bit about him later, I hope, but my roommate in New York when I was writing this book, Tennessee Jones, who was both a friend of mine from grad school, terrific writer, who about 3 months, I think I'd been working on this project, we lived together, and about 3 months into the project, he said, "Oh, I was in Seattle, right?" I thought you could have told me that a couple months ago, right? And he said, we started talking about why I didn't go. he said, "Oh man, jail was great. I had like a love affair while I was in jail." He said, "I met a guy, and he had a good time." And we can talk about that later, because Tennessee really helped me with a lot of the research. But we'll talk about that. So I had a really strong emotional connection to it. And just one more quick story. As a writer, I don't think I had yet connected the things that I cared about as a person with the things that seemed to be appropriate to write about. So my dad's from Sri Lanka, my mom is from Montana. I was following that dictum all the early years that I was writing of write what you know. And I thought that meant, write angry young men whose fathers were from Sri Lanka and mothers were from Montana growing up in Pennsylvania. I thought that's what that meant. And and you can really, you could debate the literary merits of that. Well, it wasn't good stuff. It was like if Jhumpa Lahiri and Junot Diaz had an angry baby. That was me. And I think I was probably imitating what I thought was good writing, reading The New Yorker and thinking I was supposed to write like that. And I think one of the biggest lessons and one of the biggest gifts that happened to me was I read Don DeLillo's book Libra, which is a retelling of the JFK assassination. And that's not important, but what is important is that it was about recent American history. It was about something I wasn't alive for, but I remember. And it brought the subject of literature closer to me. And I thought to myself, oh, that's interesting to write about recent history. What would I write about? And boom, right? And I thought WTO, right? And I had never considered it a subject sort of worthy of writing a novel. That's my own crazy brain. But once I realized once I thought of the idea, everything started rolling. All the circuits were connected, because now I wasn't writing to get published in the New Yorker or for anyone else's really validation. I was writing because I cared about the thing. I cared about it so much. And then, then I was off and running. Let me say one more thing about it. So when I started the research for this book, I came across a photo very early on, taken by Alan Sekulow, who's a Seattle photographer who has since passed away. And he had a series of pretty amazing photos from the protest. And there's one of a woman on her knees in an intersection. She's been clearly hit by a baton, or something has hit her, and she's bleeding. Long red hair. She's a white woman. And I saw that picture, and a medic is tending to her head. I saw that picture and I thought, well, one, what courage it takes to be there when I myself, specifically was too scared to be there for that very reason. What courage it takes to be there. Two, why is she there? Because she's not really fighting to expand her own set of rights or really improve her own life. Here's a woman who I don't know, fighting for the rights of maybe a kid in Sri Lanka who makes shoes, or a fisherman in Thailand and the kind of nets they use. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting moment. That's a moment of what we call globalization, but is this like very human moment of globalization where empathy has become globalized. As Arundhati Roy famously said, the only thing worth globalizing is dissent. And that was a moment like that. I would say also, it's worth globalizing love too, right? And that was one of those moments. And that picture inspired me, it scared me, it confused me, because I thought, what is she doing there? And those are all the things you want to write a book, or those are all things I wanted to write a book, to be sufficiently confused so that I could have, enter into this. Because I had no desire to preach or to write, to have a message or have an intention. For me, I'm more interested in sort of pursuing questions and trying to pose them properly. And I think that's one of the reasons it came out with 7 characters, was because I had all those different perspectives and wanted to explore them, I hope that 15-minute answer covered. Do you want to ask a question, Kristen?
Well, first, I think she had a second part, which was, is there another historical...
I told you, I knew I would forget it. What was the second part?
Is there another historical day that you think would be also worthy of a novel?
I like this genre, this idea of nonfiction novels, and recent historical events. I think, though, rather than doing an event, I might do maybe a person and try to talk about a person's life, talk about a real person in a kind of fake biography. I'm tempted to tell you who I'm thinking about. Okay, just between us. In 1981, John Hinckley tried to assassinate President Reagan, and came damn close. What if he had killed Ronald Reagan, and in the next election, Nancy Reagan had been elected the president of the United States? That's as far as I've gotten. So. But my God, we got, the affair with Frank Sinatra. We have the whole, I'm fascinated with the 80s. So I don't know if there's a moment. I never set out to write one day. Actually, I got to 500 pages, and I still thought I was going to do all 5 days. It was going to be a 3,000-page novel, I guess. And then I was like, maybe I'll just do day one. So, yeah.
So if I can follow up, it occurs to me that authors take special care in naming their characters. No?
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
What's up with the name Victor? How did you choose it?
Yeah, they're so allegorical, I didn't actually realize that, and I heard it in a podcast, and these people were rolling their eyes. Although they liked the book, they're like, oh, Victor, come on, Bishop. And I'm like, oh, yeah, you're right. I'm not good at naming characters. And so Victor's actually, Sherman Alexie is one of my heroes, and one of his, what's Victor's last name? Is it Victor Falls Apart? Or Victor Falls Down a Lot? One of Sherman's, main characters is named Victor. That's where it comes from. I didn't have any... In fact, I'd probably go back and change the names because they are so allegorical that, King, I knew what I was doing. I thought it was... But I admit it in the first line. I like that irony, And it actually came out of a conversation right when I was writing the book, and I just randomly, I said to a woman, oh yeah, you'll be queen of something. She said, heck no, I'm going to be the king. I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's kind of cool. Okay, I'll steal that. But no, I didn't mean for them to be allegorical.
I think you've started to answer my question with what you've said to this point, but I know that you researched a great deal to write this book. I know that that's so. It's certainly read true. I'm reading place names that I recognize. The buildings are named. Bill Clinton is there, Madeleine Albright, the bombing in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
So it just felt like truth to me.
Thank you. It's a lot of work to do that.
And 6 of your characters, to me, were wonderful representatives of groups of people who had been there. I just had trouble with the chief of police.
Okay, yeah.
Because I'm one of many here probably who remember Norm Stamper.
Sure.
And his actions during those days, and I could picture him. So a question I have is, could you explain for me the difference between fiction and historical fiction and creative nonfiction?
Oof, it's a great question. Please stay at the mic, because I actually want to ask you something. But I don't really know, honestly. It's something I struggled with the whole time of, should I be writing a nonfiction book, or what is the line between fiction and nonfiction? To me, I guess a simple answer is it's a true event with mostly made-up people, although you've clearly put your finger on my inspiration for Chief Bishop, although some of it is different. I had to go back and, Chief Stamper has a great chapter in his memoir about Seattle, saying that it's the biggest regret of his career was firing tear gas on, escalating it, the original escalation, although there were reasons. But yeah, it's a funny line to cross. I mean, tell me what you thought about that character. Did you find it too close to true? Isn't it ironic that the one that's sort of based on a real person is the one that maybe for you didn't read as true? Or was it because you had a real life example?
It was because I could picture who really was
Right.
the mayor, and it felt almost like you just stole his life and turned him into a character.
I don't think the background has any. As far as I know, none of the background is him. To me, the thing that I really took from Chief Stamper was quite literally just that dilemma of being a pretty good cop, being a great cop, and coming out of a history of like community policing and being stuck in a really tough situation, you know. Originally for me, and I think this is easy to understand, in the early drafts, the cops were the villains. It was just an easy dramatic choice, like sort of the natural way to tell the story was like, oh, protesters were good and cops were bad. And that was such a not interesting way to tell the story. And so as I started to revise, I thought, I really need to write these characters, the police, much better. It's very difficult to write, really cops, lawyers, and doctors, because that's what all our TV shows are about. You know, so it's really hard to get past your own cliches, you know, of what cops are, or lawyers or doctors. So I needed some help. But the thing that I really focused on and that I got from Chief Stamper was, what does it mean? Let's assume that this person is a good person and wants to do the right thing, doesn't want to hurt people, but is yet tasked and with a lot of pressure from above, the forces above, including the mayor and the Secret Service, because Clinton is arriving, to clear the streets, and is really put in a completely untenable position. So I'm fascinated. I think all these characters are fairly ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And I think that's the job of a writer. That's part of what drama is to put people in the pressure cooker and see what happens.
Have you heard from Norm Stamper?
I haven't. I would love to. Yeah. If anyone
Thank you.
knows his email, you know, tell him, please get in touch. Okay. Okay. He probably doesn't want to think about this or hear from me, but I'd love to hear from him. Yeah.
Hello. From the beginning of the book through the whole thing, I was struck by the musical rhythm of your language and the lyrical quality of the writing. And I was wondering, was there a specific playlist that you listened to while you were writing?
Phil Collins. No. Well, thank you. There was, in fact, a very specific playlist I listened to, but I don't think that influenced the rhythm of the language. I'll tell you the playlist at the end of, it'll be my little treat at the end of my answer. But regarding the rhythm, you know, I was really lucky to study with Gordon Lish, who's one of the really influential editors of the last 50 years. He was the editor who really made Raymond Carver, made or unmade, as the case may be. And he said something really interesting when I studied with him. He said, as a writer, you only have two tools to be original. And I thought he was going to say character, plot, scene. He said syntax and diction. Whoa, what a weird, I don't think that's true, but whoa, what a weird thing to think about. So when I was writing the book, for better or for worse, my intention wasn't to be original. My intention was to write language that was just off enough that it would require the reader to pay attention. You know, because that's what I wanted. Because first of all, I'm a reader first. I love books. And I know that one of the pleasures of books is falling into them. But I also know one of the pleasures of books is coming out of that with a sort of new way of looking at the world. Or just for a second you come out and you see differently. And it helps, I think, to be bumped out once in a while, to have the language bump you out once in a while. So it's sort of, the rhythm lulls you a little bit. There's a lot of, ton of repetition to lull you. And then there'll be, you know, one of the writing tricks is like always do things in threes. So if you're going to do a list, do a trinity. So I would intentionally do 4. And you can feel it, you know, it bumps you a little bit. So I did that, and if it came out rhythmically, I'm happy about that. My playlist was, I listened in like crazy amounts of Bob Dylan. and his 80s stuff, which is even, the weird stuff. And the other thing is that I would often, because it was distracting to listen to music, so I would just put on, and I've heard Stephen King does this, but I would put on one song and just leave it on repeat. And so by the end of the day, iTunes will keep track of how many times you've listened to songs. It would be like 460, by the end of the day or whatever, because it's like a 3 or 4 minute song. I listened a lot to, there's a Bob Dylan song called Ring Them Bells. Listen to that a lot. Just a lot of Dylan, yeah. And maybe, some of that Dylan's social conscious filtered in, but I don't think I would never claim that I was influenced by his language, yeah. But it helped to listen to something really repetitive and kind of get into this sort of trance state,
I was there, and a friend and I from Bellingham went down early that day and spent the entire day there. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that I did enjoy your book, but my favorite part was the Sri Lankan delegate.
Oh, good.
And how his realization of how things work evolved through the book.
Yeah.
And that was my favorite part. And also, you didn't bring up the flashbang bombs until late in the story.
Yeah, the concussion grenades, yeah.
Oh my God. I'm sure there's some vets here, but...
Did you experience that? So I watched a lot of video and I listened to a lot of audio, and that looks so scary.
The blinding light and then the concussion that you felt clear into your bowels, and those were going off quite a bit around us.
And what's the term for those kind of...
Flashbang is what they call it.
In general, non-lethal weapons, non-lethal
sure.
crowd control.
Yeah.
Okay.
But,
just to the edge, right?
And then I did witness some of the personal pepper spraying, and I was really glad that you didn't focus like the media did on the anarchists, because they were just a handful of people. This buddy and I, we wanted to see what they were up to, and so we started following them.
Is that right?
Because they would beat on drums and chant, and then they would just race 2 or 3 blocks away, stop, do it again. So we started running with them to, see what they're up to.
Yeah.
And then they started breaking windows and stuff, and we we're out of here.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just saying.
Yeah, it was really important to me to not. The news narrative was, of course, focused. We saw the image again and again and again of a newspaper box through the window of the Starbucks.
Right.
And the numbers were there was 20 or 30 of those people. Yeah. And 60 to 90,000 nonviolent protesters.
There were hundreds of people in costume with their kids, dressed like whales and frogs and you name it. It was just amazing.
Yeah, just an amazing thing.
And we talked to cops. Some wouldn't even speak to us. Some were friendly.
Yeah. Originally this book was 604 pages, and that's another story. But it really deserves like a 1,000-page book, because I had scenes where these guys are meeting with the cops and talking with the cops, because that's one of the dynamics that was really interesting. That wasn't kind of people at war. One of the things that fascinated me was what is it that I don't think cops get up in the morning wanting to have a riot. I hope, right?
Right.
But there is something about putting on that body armor.
I think you really caught the fear factor. The police were as afraid as a lot of the demonstrators.
Yeah. I think, they were really outnumbered. And it would have been terrifying.
Yeah.
To speak a little bit about the research, when I came to Seattle, I found a couple things. I found in the University of Washington Library in the basement, there was an archive of stuff, firsthand stuff. So a professor had put out a call for stuff. So I found a lot of turtle costumes that, literally the turtle costume had been sent in and put in a box. There were tons of photos and signs and firsthand accounts, and so that was great stuff. On the other side, I also found when I was in Seattle, recordings of all the police radio traffic from the 5 days. It had all been recorded. And that was in the archives at City Hall. And when I tried to start writing the police officers with a little more compassion or empathy from my part as a writer, I went and listened to those recordings. And it was really the first time I heard a cop scared that I thought, oh, I can write this. I know I have a way in. And you could hear the noise, bouncing off the buildings behind them, the drums and the flutes. And I thought, man, I'd be terrified, and you could hear it in his voice calling for help. And I thought, oh, this is pretty interesting.
Well, one thing I've taken away from that whole experience is that we were right.
Yeah. Wait, can you? What do you mean? In terms of trade or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's another thing too, which is, I'll be honest. I'll say two things. One is, I wrote this book. I never in a million years thought I'd be here talking to you about it. So I really thank you for sharing your experience. I never meant to appropriate anyone else's experience or tell your story. This is just my version of it. And I am sure that no one who was there was sitting around waiting 18 years to find out what I thought about it. Right? So I felt very confident in a way telling the story because there had been so many nonfiction stories. This story had been told so many other times and it's been told so well in nonfiction documents. There's been so many great films made about it. Shia Mercer, I think who's here, made a great documentary called Trade Off. But there've been a lot, really good. So I didn't feel like I was the only one speaking about it, Otherwise, I probably would have never done it. Why don't we move on? Anyone else?
Is it my turn?
Yeah, hi.
So I have a question about one of the scenes in the book.
Sure.
And it has to do with the Sri Lankan delegate,
Okay.
who was my favorite character, by the way.
Oh, cool.
And so our introduction of him, he's on the airplane, and he meets the actress. And it's that scene that I'm wondering about. Why her? Why the sexualization of him with her? What was that about?
You guys are such good readers. You guys are such good I can't get away with anything. So I'll tell you a really interesting story about that. So the reason is it's a bad scene, quite honestly. That was one of the first things that I wrote. And I'll tell you a story about Charles. He started out as a completely different character. He was one of the first characters I wrote when I was still in school, and I wrote him for comic relief. And so he was a bumbling Sri Lankan diplomat, very much in awe of civilization. He drank too much. He ordered oysters. He spent his expense account on fancy shoes in Paris. He was enamored with this actress. And one of the things about the structure of the book, is that those sections occur in intermissions, right? So I wrote a lot of it and then put it aside. And literally over the years, everyone else, all the other characters were together. And I was working on all that and, maturing as a person, maturing in my understanding of the protest, maturing in the sense of what does it mean to write characters in a generous way, write characters that are smarter than you, the author, and all those things about growing up as a writer. And poor Charles sat there and didn't grow up. And it was right at the end, after me writing the book 4 years. I have to tell you about losing the book. But me writing the book for 4 years, an agent accepting it, and it wasn't until we finally put all the pieces together. And I remember the comment came, I think from his assistant, my agent's assistant. She said, could you go through the Charles sections? And his name was DP at the time. And there's you say boobs a lot, because there was a lot of sexualization, and he was meant to be this sort of inept womanizer, I guess.
Wow, because I don't read him that way at all now.
Oh my God!
Except
No.
for that
So
one
I'm
scene.
getting there. I'm getting there.
Yeah.
So I went, and they expected a 3-day edit for me to scratch out boobs, but I thought, what have I written? It was actually a profound thing for me. I was like, why did I write? Why, given okay, here's your assignment, write a Sri Lankan delegate. Why did I go for goofy? Do you know what I mean? And I think it has a kind of profound racial answer, or it came out of my own colonized imagination. That's really what I believe. And out of my father's own kind of colonized, conflicted relationship with Sri Lanka. Like, why did I feel the need to laugh at Sri Lanka? And it's so interesting how writing a book forces you to face those things. Like you, for me at least, I put so many of my own prejudices on the page, and then had to examine them. And so this sounds silly, but I said I need some examples of men of color, men or women of color, who from third world nations, who are dignified, who handle themselves with grace. And so I read Nelson Mandela's autobiography, I watched a bunch of movies. I'm still blown away by Mandela and how he could come out of 40 years in jail and feel compassion and act in the way that he did. It blows my mind. And that was one of the feelings where I was just blown away by the dignity of Mr. Mandela, And I thought, what am I doing with this goofy guy? And I went and read a lot of Dr. King. I went and read a lot of Gandhi. And what was supposed to be a 3-day edit turned into 3 months, where I was sort of trying to decolonize my own brain. And then I went and threw away all of it, except the dumb scene with the actress. I kept that. I don't know why I kept that. But
in a way, I liked it because it showed his vulnerability and his humanity.
Yeah.
But at the end of it, I was somewhat wondering why we cared what she thought.
Yeah, and she disappears, and like, what's the story? And it's just a mistake.
Oh.
Thank you for pointing it out.
I wasn't trying to.
No. Honestly, you guys are really good readers. Really good readers. I hope the rest of his narrative was a little more satisfying for you.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, great.
So I'm actually, I'm not a big protest person. I never really understood it, I don't think. But I really appreciated your book because I feel like I understand it a little bit better now. My question has to do with the characters. Do you think that this experience allowed them to grow? And if you do you think you did that on purpose, or did they just evolve on their own?
Like, specifically the characters or people in the protest? The characters.
The characters, yes.
Yeah, I have to say, I always thought it was total nonsense when people said, I was writing the book and then the characters took over. And I was writing this book and the characters took over. Like, you can actually feel where it happens. It's like about 2/3 of the way through. And, one of the reasons that they didn't take over before that, this was, like, someone, when you're asking what is a nonfiction novel, what does that even mean? I was sort of working that out for myself even as I was writing it. So I felt a deep obligation to tell the truth and get the facts right and, make sure that I made it clear that the tear gas went off before the first window was broken. And that things like that were accurate, that I didn't glorify the violence, that those scenes are real. I mean, that all comes from things that I researched or discovered. On the other hand was this obligation to imagination. And about 2/3 of the way through, I think, it's not exactly that the characters take over, but you know them so well you can't force them to do things that they wouldn't do. And going into the book, I would have said I'm not a protest person either. I didn't think it was politically effective. I thought it was just a way to feel better. And the crazy thing is, writing the book and having to inhabit these people as generously as I could, and as I got older as a writer, knowing that that's what writing's really about, I found my views changing, really. And being so much less concerned with, is protest the most politically effective way to bring about change? Well, that's besides the point in some ways. It's a way, it's a form of tremendous solidarity. People who come out of that remember it and form bonds with people that, last for years. Think about this. It was such an amazing moment of people marching in Seattle that me as a kid in Pennsylvania it affected me so much that I ended up writing a novel about it, 20 years later. So and Rebecca Solnit talks about in her book, Hope in the Dark, we never really know, we might not ever see the effects of our actions, and that's what hope is about in a way. So yeah, the characters did grow, I think. And in the last third of the book, I was sort of really following them. I had an outline, I had a great outline, but I had to tear it up and kind of just go with it, go with them. All that stuff at the end, when John Henry lies down in front of the peacekeeper on the ground, and everyone starts laying down with him. That just sort of popped into my head one day, and as what he would do. King and what happens with her, and all of it. Yeah. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So the character I was gonna.
What did you win the ribbon for?
My husband made me wear it because it's my birthday.
Oh, Brian!
Yeah.
Hello. Happy birthday! Happy 30th birthday!
Yeah. The character I wanted to talk about was Edie, and the whole situation of being there and being one of the most passive, and then being one that was the most brutalized. And then that's sort of the catalyst for Victor's awakening and realizing, the people. I wanted to know, how you came up with that, because that is his aha moment. Did you sort of create her from things that you saw, or an amalgamation of things that you put together? Because the brutalization was just so much that when my book club read it, a lot of the women said that was the hardest part for them to go through.
I almost wish I would almost take that. Stay at the microphone so we can talk. I almost wish I could take that scene out, because it's so hard to read. It was so hard to write, and it's almost too much for people, I think. But it's true. It didn't happen in Seattle exactly, but it's like word for word. It happened in the Redwoods when people were first perfecting that technique of the lock boxes. They were doing it around redwood trees. And so the cops were perfecting the techniques of how do we get people out of these things, and pepper spray was one, let's put people in a lot of pain. And so that was pretty accurate to what happened there. And then in Seattle, I read a lot of, you can watch any of the videos, and you'll see people getting pepper sprayed from right here. Or, one of the first things I encountered when I was in the library at University of Washington was a guy who said he was on his back in an intersection, and a cop not only sprayed him or wiped gauze on his face, but I don't know how this works, but took the top off the pepper spray bottle and just poured it over his head.
Yeah.
I mean,
the one that everyone that I've talked to had the hardest time with was when they put it on the Q-tips and went under her eye.
That's as far as I could, from what I read, that was real.
Okay.
Because they were kind of trying to figure out how bad it was going to be. They didn't know. So I have to say, so you asked about Edie as a character. She was a much more developed character. She was based on, I used to actually go into prisons with Quakers and do nonviolent conflict resolution training with prisoners. And so she was actually based on someone I'd known a long time, a Quaker woman. And just in the process of editing, we had to take a lot of her backstory out so that she's not much of a character. And then, to be honest, the scene was so horrific that we couldn't do it to one of the main characters because it would have been absolutely unreadable.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where in the real world you're like, oh, I don't know if I'm totally comfortable with that, because you're exactly right. You guys are really good readers. Yeah. Here's a really passive character, a woman who's not showing much agency, who then gets brutalized, and that's not really the narrative I want to tell. But sort of was, trying to just working with the text. That's how it happened. Okay. Yeah. So that's a great question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Happy birthday. Hi.
Time for more questions?
Yeah, of course.
So my question is not about the Sri Lankan delegate, but I have to say that airplane scene was one of my favorite.
Okay.
I love the fact that the actress sort of presented this sort of typical privileged American perspective of Sri Lanka. I love those beaches, and that was her perspective on things. And I just kind of cringed when I heard her saying those things and thinking about how we view the third world. And I also loved your portrayal of the delegate, and I can't remember his name, but as an older man who had sexual yearnings and insecurities, and so I really like that. Okay, but my real
Different book though, probably.
Well, maybe, yeah, but I like that. So as the parent of teenagers, I'm having more and more moments of, did I really say that, and did I really do that? And one of the scenes that was really hard for me to read was when Bishop found Victor in the basement smoking pot and reading his mom's books.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could speak to that scene and.
Yeah, so he reacts kind of violently, very angry.
Yeah.
Very angry. I mean, that doesn't come out of a little bit of my experience.
And the burning of the books. What was that like as someone who loves books, to write about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was trying to understand Bishop, to be honest, and I think the whole book is playing with something. I say these things as though I meant to do them. It's more like when I read them, I find this stuff. So the whole book, I think, is dealing with how grief becomes rage. That's one of the things that's happening a lot. King would be a great example. And Bishop in that moment, I think he's in deep grief about losing his wife, and he doesn't know how to connect to his son. And so it's the grief literally of losing his wife, but also the real grief of disconnection. And then overreacting, and almost the rage coming out of the pain that he feels about missing his wife, getting confused and getting substituted and getting turned into this anger for his son. And also seeing his son headed out a path that Bishop himself doesn't like, but also thinks is very dangerous for his son. So, something you guys are really good readers. It's a relationship I wish I could have developed more, because I get into it a little bit about what it might mean to be a white man raising a brown or black son, which is a fascinating topic. And I don't think I do it justice, frankly. But I think that's one of the scenes where he reacts so angrily because he knows how dangerous it's going to be for his son. And he's very scared about what's going to happen to him when he has to go out into the world. And so that's what I was thinking of when that happens. And the burning of the books is like, just felt right to me. Like it's the burning of all the memories. He's everyone thinks they're trying to do the right thing, and are very often not. And to me, that's almost like, oh, if I could just burn these memories, it won't haunt me anymore. But yeah, it will. Because the other thing in the book is so much about the unspoken histories that we feel the pain of, and like, or unspoken connections. So quite literally, the globalization to me is, walking through the supermarket and, putting my bananas in the shopping cart and not thinking twice about the fact that they come from Costa Rica or Peru, just not making those connections, or eating the burger and not thinking about any of that. So all the ways in which we're encouraged not to think about where all this stuff comes from, or all the ways that our lives connect with lives all over the world, and part of the book is like trying to. Again, I don't think I did this consciously, but I can see it. It wants to come out. It wants to just be verbalized. And it's not a moral judgment, like, you're so bad for buying a banana from Peru. It's more like, well, let's just be aware of it. Or, I just wanted to name it, I guess. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I'm also a fan of the Sri Lankan delegate.
Hey, this is great.
And I liked hearing how he evolved, because I think he ended up being the most evolved character,
yeah.
And that he was big-hearted enough not to be pissed off at the people who stopped his meeting with Bill Clinton to, in fact, loving them, which I found remarkable. I think more, however, about King, because I am a protest person. I didn't go to the WTO because I was pregnant, and I thought that would be irresponsible of me. But I did grow up protesting. I grew up in the D.C. area. And being a left-leaning, well-meaning person, I could sometimes look back and cringe at, think of myself as a dilettante. But, there's something to be said about standing up and being counted.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I had a friend who was like King, and she was fierce. Well, that made me think, and maintaining my relationship with her through all these years, she's still back east, and now she's the mother of a police officer.
Wow.
Her perspectives have changed.
Instant karma, huh?
Yeah, karma backlash. So I'm wondering, in your mind, what King's doing today?
That's funny. Someone asked me earlier about Victor. I said, I think he's selling cell phones at the mall. But, I mean, who knows? Our lives take such turns, I mean, if I had to write a sequel, I think there's a line. Can I read it? And even though I said that Victor's the main character, in a lot of ways I think King is the main character. For me, on this sort of emotional journey. What the TV did not show. I won't read the whole chapter. The convoy of 20 trucks rumbling through the streets, tarp covered and flat green, headlights cutting weird and spooky shapes in the night. The 800 souls aboard, rocking and jostling, heads down, contemplating the bayonet, thinking this was the weirdest of missions, a convoy of 20 National Guard trucks rolling through an American city, American soldiers going armed in the American night, the loose edge of the tarp flapping in the running breeze. But the TV didn't show that. The TV didn't show the hospitals or the schools or the prisons, the smell of ammonia and blood, the certain sterile smell King associated with death in modern corridors, the clinical light which dimmed, or the pain which ripped through her shoulder as King tried to lift her right hand and found it handcuffed to the gurney. Because she's been shot, right? And she's in the ambulance. And she's been shot for trying to attack the peacekeeper, the truck. The pain which ripped through her shoulder as King tried to lift her right hand and found it handcuffed to the gurney. The pain which went all the way inside her muscles and liver and kidney as if she had been sliced open from head to toe and then roughly cut into as many pieces as each organ would allow. The TV didn't show her being whisked through the twilight city by efficient forces beyond her control, handcuffed in an ambulance while the sirens cried and the cars pulled to the shoulder so they could pass, and King thinking all she had done and all she had become, and every rule and code she had broken, and everything she had believed and then burned. How many of her friends beaten, broken, in jail, serving sentences for trying to break the spell. Everything she had tried to live and failed. The ambulance and the EMT and King suddenly tearing at the tubes, using her free hand to rip at the IV lines in her arm, tear at the tube that wound down her throat, the sudden rush of activity in the small space which was filled with his moving body, and the warning tones which monitored her life, and her head bucking, and the lines whipping back and forth as she tore them free, and the medic's weight against her body trying to hold her down, and King croaking into his face, "Let me die. Please just let me die." The man who took her hand in his, not an effort of restraint, but holding her hand and looking into her face. And in his eyes she saw not the state, not institutionalized evil, not modern medicine and all its chemical compromises, not the death of human connection, not a servant of that state which built prisons for you at every turn. No, what she saw in his eyes and his face was nothing more than simple human concern, the sudden affection of one human being for another. And she had broken everything she had ever built, smashed it to pieces, and even still she had watched Victor beaten and watched a man bleed to death in the sand, and the light of a single candle glowing from inside their homes of salvaged wood and tin, and she with her home of food and electricity, and there was a warmth coming from his eyes as he held her hand and said, "You're going to live." She felt the warmth and smoothness of his palm encircling hers as he said, "It's going to hurt like hell, darling, but you're going to live." This wasn't what the TV showed. It didn't show him holding her hand, or the siren wailing, or the machines beeping, or the singing of the tires on the asphalt as they raced her to the hospital. And it didn't show all she knew or all she believed. And it didn't show how she might in some way live in this world the way it was. So I would say we don't know what happens to King, but she's going to live. And it's going to hurt like hell, but she's going to live.
Especially if her kid becomes a cop.
For what?
Especially if her kid becomes a cop.
Right. There you go. Yeah, Linda.
There are 3 words that you give to John Henry and 3 words that you sign your books with. Mad with hope. And I'm intrigued with that, and I want to know where the emphasis is. Is it on mad? Is it on hope?
Well, wouldn't you have to be crazy to have any hope in this world? But don't you want to be crazy?
Yes.
There's no other choice.
And I'm crazier as a result of reading your book.
Yeah, that's how I feel.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Are we good? Thank you so much. Really, I'm feeling it as a person, and it's really, really a pleasure and really an honor to be invited here with people who experience this. It really means a lot to me, so thank you. Thank you a lot.
Thank you all so much for your great questions. We really, we all got a lot out of this. And I was instructed to ask one more question while you're up here. Well, as long as we're here.
Okay. Step into the light.
I'll come into the light.
Yes.
All right. So you mentioned briefly, or I think I mentioned, that you wrote this book twice.
Oh, I didn't tell the story.
You got to share that.
I'll tell you. So I started this book in New York in 2009 when I was back in school, when I wrote those bad scenes that you pointed out. And I failed to cut them. William Faulkner says, murder your darlings. You gotta. So the truth is, I thought the scene was funny, and I kept it, and that's a mistake. Cut it. Anyway, I started it, and I had about 100 pages when I graduated. And I moved to Chile, to a little beach house in Chile, and I didn't have any internet, which was great. I finished the book by Christmas, and it was 604 pages. I mean, I was cruising. Kind of a perfect life. I had a girlfriend there who I really cared about, but she lived in the city, and I lived on the beach, and so we didn't see each other during the week. And then she'd come up on the weekend. I wouldn't think about writing for 2 days. We'd go to the beach. We'd eat we'd eat fish and stuff. I think it's called pescado a la pobre. It's like a fried fish on top of French fries on top of an egg. Like, awesome, right? And then on Monday, I knew I'd go back to writing. So it was a perfect life. I didn't have any internet, so I got a lot done, but I didn't back up the book. Under her advice, I actually would hide my laptop in the oven, in the baking tray, because she said there was gypsies that would sell jam and would rob the house, so I should hide the laptop in the... But it was okay. I don't do much baking, so it survived all that. I finished, and I came back to the States to do the job that I did, which was, at the time, I was a traveling salesman. I sold posters on college campuses. At the beginning of every semester, I'd get a huge truck and visit colleges and make my money, and then take it and go back to somewhere like Chile to write. I didn't email it to myself. I didn't back it up. I was at my dad's house. I didn't print it because I thought he'd be mad I'd burn out his printer. I also couldn't find 604 pages of paper. And I was in Chicago, and someone broke into my hotel room and stole my laptop. Yeah, and there was a bunch of stuff in the backpack, like an iPod and a Kindle, and who cares? I was like, oh my God, my book, it's gone. And I'd never written anything that long. It was like it coming out of the investment of grad school. It was like, And I actually don't remember really what happened for about 6 months. I know I went back to my dad's house, and I know I watched every episode of Friday Night Lights. As one does.
Yeah, get the pain out.
Well, just to numb, you know? I ate a lot of hamburger. Like, I just, my own bad coping mechanisms, and tried not to think about it. I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to write the book again. And it started bubbling up in my brain again. Not the horror of what had happened, but like technical issue. Oh, I wonder what if I just did one day, or, And when that happened, I thought, oh my God. And it wasn't, oh my God, I'm going to write the book again. It was, oh God, I'm going to write the book again. What is wrong with me? And I've read somewhere, writing is a bit like a disease. And I was like, oh my God, I have the disease. This is terrible. But in the end, it was actually a great gift, because probably the whole book, it had about 65 characters. It was this postmodern pastiche, a very grad school kind of book, that first book. I had made up an encyclopedia where I defined things, and then I, cut it up and pasted it through my novel. So it was like you found the novel. And, it turns out, so there's a lot of information that I had to deal with in the book. And that was like one of the techniques I thought I was doing a good job at. But it turns out no one cares what the definition of the WTO is. What we care about when we read is, how does the character feel about the WTO, right? And it took me 10 years of writing and losing a book to realize that. And also to realize, so I started rewriting it from my notes, and I had really detailed notes, but it was like taking dictation from myself. Rewriting it, and from a younger, dumber version of myself, no good, no bueno. So I ripped up the notes, threw them away, and I really got the gift of being allowed to approach the subject again, and to ask myself, well, why do I read? I grew up, I love reading. I grew up, libraries were really my church. So I said, well, what do I love to read? Do I love to read books with pictures of owls in them and weird encyclopedias? And I thought, no, that's cool. I'm interested in that. It's intellectually interesting, but I'm not in school anymore. There's no one to impress. It's just me, with this, failed project or missing project. And do I want to do it again or not? And I do want to do it again. And what am I going to do? And I thought, the books that I love to read are about people, and they're about ordinary people undergoing extraordinary circumstances and forced to make difficult choices, and people that I can understand, even if I don't necessarily always like them, even if I don't necessarily always like their decisions, I'm with them, and I feel a part of their experience. And so that was my new mission. That's what I set out to do. So in the end, it was a gift. I got old in the process. Writing a book is the worst time machine in the world. You get in, set it for 6 years, and then you get out and 6 years have passed. Sorry. Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible time machine. I'm kidding. It's such a joy. Such a joy.
Okay, I was curious, how many people here, I know the birthday boy is in a book group. How many other people in the audience are in book groups? Yeah! The book for Whatcom Reads 2019 is The Big Burn, Teddy Roosevelt and the Fire That Saved America by best-selling author and New York Times columnist Timothy Egan. Yeah, that should be good. So you have about 12 months to read and discuss this epic and timely book, which you can find at area libraries and Village Books. We hope to see you at Whatcom Reads events next year, and let's give one more big round of applause for Sunil Yapa.
Thank you. To you guys, really. Thank you so much, guys.